August 19, 1944. Deep within the forests of East Prussia, behind reinforced concrete walls 3 meters thick, German General Oberst Alfred Jodl sat in the operations room of the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's eastern headquarters. Before him lay intelligence reports that should have brought satisfaction, perhaps even relief. The Allied forces that had stormed ashore at Normandy just 74 days earlier had now advanced over 400 miles inland. Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the devastated French countryside. Every principle of military science, every lesson learned from centuries of warfare, every calculation performed by Germany's finest strategic minds pointed to the same inevitable conclusion: the American advance was about to collapse under its own weight. This is a history documentary about World War II, specifically about an untold story of the Second World War that would fundamentally alter how nations understood modern military operations. What you're about to hear is a war documentary that explores not the clash of armies on battlefields, but the revolution that happened on highways, driven by men who history nearly forgot. This is the story of how 23,000 soldiers, 75% of them African American, defeated the German military not with rifles or tanks, but with truck keys and determination, creating what military historians now recognize as the most decisive logistics operation in the history of warfare. Before we continue deeper into this remarkable WW2 story, if you're passionate about military history and these lesser-known Second World War narratives that shaped our world, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from, so drop your city in the comments below. Now let's return to that moment in August 1944, when the German High Command was about to learn a lesson that would redefine everything they understood about war. General Jodl reviewed the calculations one final time. An American armored division, his staff had determined with Prussian precision, consumed approximately 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day when advancing. George Patton's Third Army, now spearheading the Allied breakthrough across France, operated 12 divisions simultaneously. The mathematics seemed irrefutable, almost beautiful in their certainty. 12 divisions, advancing on a 60-mile front, separated from their supply depots on the Normandy beaches by over 400 miles of damaged roads, destroyed bridges, and sabotaged infrastructure. The Germans themselves had ensured this during their retreat, demolishing every railway junction, every major bridge, every fuel depot that might aid the pursuing Allies. The calculation was inescapable. Within 48 hours, perhaps 72 at the absolute maximum, Patton's celebrated armored columns would sit motionless, their fuel tanks empty, their ammunition exhausted. The Seine River, just ahead of the American advance, would become a natural defensive line where the Wehrmacht could regroup, reorganize, and perhaps, just perhaps, hold until winter brought a temporary stalemate. What Jodl couldn't know, what no German commander could imagine, was that 125 miles to the west, 5,958 trucks were already rolling eastward in an endless convoy that violated every principle of military logistics he had ever studied. These vehicles moved with their headlights blazing through the night, abandoning the blackout discipline that every army in Europe considered sacred. They traveled in continuous columns so dense that one vehicle passed any given point every 30 seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were carrying 12,500 tons of supplies every single day across a purpose-built highway system that hadn't existed 2 weeks earlier. This operation, christened the Red Ball Express, using American railroad terminology for priority freight, represented something unprecedented in military history. It wasn't an evolution of logistics, it was a revolution, and it was about to demonstrate to the world that in modern industrialized warfare, the nation that could deliver the most supplies, the fastest and the farthest, would prevail regardless of tactical brilliance or strategic genius. To understand why the German General Staff was so confident in their calculations, we must first understand the tyranny of logistics that had governed warfare since armies first marched. Throughout history, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte, every military commander had confronted the same immutable reality. Soldiers must eat, weapons require ammunition, vehicles need fuel, and the farther an army advances from its supply bases, the slower and more vulnerable it becomes. This principle had been so consistently proven across millennia that it had achieved the status of natural law in military thinking. The Germans understood this intimately because they had experienced it catastrophically. Just 3 years earlier, in the summer and autumn of 1941, the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. German armored divisions had raced across the Russian landscape with breathtaking speed, advancing hundreds of miles in weeks, achieving tactical victories that seemed to herald total triumph. Then winter arrived, and with it came the reckoning. German supply lines, stretched impossibly thin across the vast Soviet distances, simply snapped. Trucks designed for European roads disintegrated on Russian dirt tracks. Horse-drawn wagons, which still constituted 80% of German military transport, couldn't keep pace with motorized spearheads. Railroad gauge differences between German and Soviet systems meant supplies piled up at transfer points hundreds of miles from the troops who desperately needed them. German soldiers, advancing in summer uniforms, froze when winter equipment failed to arrive. Tanks sat immobilized for lack of spare parts. Artillery fell silent for want of ammunition. The vaunted Wehrmacht, which had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months, ground to a halt not because Soviet soldiers defeated them in battle, but because German logistics couldn't support the advance they had initiated. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz, who commanded the 47th Panzer Corps and would later face the Red Ball Express directly, had written in July 1944, "The Americans face the same logistical impossibility we faced in Russia. Their mechanical advantage becomes a disadvantage. Machines require fuel, ammunition, parts. They have advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History teaches us what comes next: paralysis." This wasn't arrogance speaking. This was experience, carefully studied and rationally applied. German intelligence had meticulously tracked American consumption rates with the same precision they brought to all military analysis. A single M4 Sherman tank, they had documented, burned fuel at the rate of 0.5 miles per gallon on roads, significantly worse when operating cross-country. An American infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily just to maintain defensive positions, more when advancing. An armored division needed over 1,000 tons per day. Patton commanded 12 divisions, advancing simultaneously on that 60-mile front. The mathematics, by every historical precedent and logical calculation, seemed irrefutable. 12,000 tons of supplies needed daily, transported 400 miles from the beaches, over damaged roads, through a transportation network the Germans had methodically destroyed during their retreat. General Major Siegfried Westphal, who would become Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt in September, calculated with typical German thoroughness. Even if the Americans possessed unlimited trucks, which they don't, and perfect roads, which they don't, and no mechanical failures, which is impossible, they still couldn't sustain Patton's advance more than another 48 hours. Physical laws cannot be violated, not even by American industry. What the Germans failed to comprehend was that American military logistics operated on fundamentally different principles than European doctrine. Where German planning emphasized conservation of resources, careful maintenance schedules, and methodical procedures, American logistics embraced what their enemies would perceive as reckless waste. Where Germans calculated what was theoretically possible and planned to achieve 90% of that maximum, Americans calculated what seemed impossible and then built systems with enough redundancy to achieve it anyway. Where German logistics officers followed centuries of military tradition emphasizing efficiency and preservation, American logistics officers followed principles derived from Detroit assembly lines and transcontinental railroad operations. Volume overcomes inefficiency, redundancy eliminates vulnerability, speed matters more than perfection. The man who would translate these principles into operational reality was Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayers of the Motor Transport Service. On August 25, 1944, Ayers stood before a room full of skeptical officers in a requisitioned French chateau near Laval. The situation he faced was stark. Traditional supply methods had indeed collapsed under the strain of supporting the most rapid advance in military history. railway transport, the backbone of military logistics for nearly a century, couldn't function because German engineers had systematically destroyed every rail line, every junction, every switching station during their retreat. Scheduled convoy systems, which had worked adequately when the front lines were 50 miles from the beaches, had become hopelessly inadequate now that Patton's spearheads stood 400 miles inland. Depot-to-depot distribution networks, designed for methodical warfare, couldn't adapt to the fluid, explosive pace of mobile operations. "Gentlemen," Ayres announced, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had already made his decision, "we're going to create a one-way highway from Cherbourg and the beaches to the front lines. Every vehicle will run 20 hours out of 24, no stopping except for gas and emergencies. We'll move 12,500 tons daily, minimum." The silence that followed wasn't skepticism. It was something closer to disbelief. What Ayres proposed violated every principle of military transportation doctrine. One-way highways meant wasting half your road capacity. 20-hour operations meant destroying vehicles and exhausting drivers. No-stop policies meant abandoning proper convoy discipline and maintenance schedules. Moving 12,500 tons daily over 400 miles would require a fleet of trucks operating at efficiency levels no military in history had ever achieved. Yet Ayres had the backing of men who understood industrial systems better than military tradition. General John C.H. Lee, who commanded logistics for the entire European theater, had studied not at military academies but in the School of American Industrial Expansion. He understood that in modern mechanized warfare, the side that could treat vehicles as disposable commodities rather than precious assets possessed an overwhelming advantage. The name came from American railroad terminology. In freight operations, a red ball shipment took absolute priority over everything else, running express without stops or delays. The Red Ball Express would operate on exactly that principle: absolute priority, no delays, no exceptions. Within 36 hours of Ayres' announcement, the impossible became operational. The technical specifications defied everything German military doctrine considered possible. 2 parallel one-way highways would be established, marked with red balls painted on utility poles every mile. One highway for loaded trucks moving toward the front, one for empty trucks returning to the beaches. Both routes would operate 24 hours daily, with headlights blazing, completely abandoning the blackout discipline that every European military considered sacred. A no-stop policy would be enforced except for fuel and mechanical emergencies. Any vehicle that couldn't maintain at least 25 miles per hour would be pulled off the road immediately by military police. Convoys would depart every 5 minutes, maintaining an average speed of 35 miles per hour. Mobile maintenance units would be positioned every 50 miles along the route to perform emergency repairs without stopping the flow of traffic. The scale required to implement this system was staggering. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of what was officially designated the Communication Zone, reviewed the projected requirements. "We need 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles minimum, operating at 90% availability. That's impossible by any logistics textbook ever written." Yet on August 26, 1944, just 24 hours after the initial planning meeting, drivers from the 316th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, universally known as the Deuce and a Half, loaded with 105mm artillery shells bound for Patton's guns at Melun, 300 miles east. The demographic composition of the Red Ball Express would have stunned German racial theorists and challenged American military culture simultaneously. Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually operate the route, approximately 75% were African American soldiers serving in a still rigorously segregated United States Army. These men couldn't eat in white restaurants or use white facilities in much of their home country. They served in separate units, commanded mostly by white officers, and were systematically excluded from combat roles based on racist assumptions about their capabilities and courage. Yet these same men, judged unfit for combat by their own military, were now entrusted with keeping the most celebrated white generals in the American Army supplied and mobile. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the drivers themselves. They understood they were fighting two wars simultaneously: the official war against Nazi Germany's racist ideology and the unofficial war against America's own racial prejudices. Every mile they drove, every ton they delivered, every impossible deadline they met became evidence against the racial theories that oppressed them at home and that the Nazis had elevated to state policy. They painted slogans on their trucks that reflected both missions: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express, and occasionally, with bitter humor, Jim Crow Convoy. These men created their own culture within hours of the operation's launch. They developed traffic rules that prioritized movement above all else. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately when faster trucks approached. Mechanical failures were pushed into ditches without ceremony or paperwork. Any truck falling below 20 miles per hour was considered a roadblock and removed from the convoy by military police. By August 28th, just 3 days into the operation, German reconnaissance units began reporting something unprecedented, something that defied their understanding of military operations. Units from Aufklärungsabteilung 116, the reconnaissance battalion attached to the 116th Panzer Division, radioed from positions overlooking the main Red Ball route. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing, no blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour passing observation point. Americans have abandoned all military precaution. This observation violated everything German military doctrine had taught for generations. Headlights at night invited air attack from any aircraft in the vicinity. Continuous columns with no spacing between vehicles presented perfect artillery targets, allowing a few well-placed shells to create roadblocks that would halt entire convoys for hours. The absence of blackout discipline meant American movements could be tracked constantly, allowing German forces to predict their logistics network and target it effectively. Yet the Americans seemed utterly unconcerned with these vulnerabilities. They blazed their headlights through the night, as if daring the Luftwaffe to attack. They packed their trucks so tightly that from German observation posts, the highway appeared to be a river of light flowing endlessly eastward. They made no effort whatsoever to conceal their routes, their schedules, or their destinations. General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions on August 30th. His report to Army Group B headquarters reflected alarm that bordered on disbelief. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night, without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules we understand. It's not military science. It's mass production applied to warfare. Feuchtinger had identified the fundamental difference between German and American military logistics, though he struggled to articulate its full implications. German doctrine emphasized concealment because German forces operated with limited resources that had to be protected carefully. Americans relied on volume because American industry could produce vehicles faster than combat could destroy them. German logistics conserved vehicles through meticulous maintenance because replacements were scarce. Americans assumed 20% mechanical failure rates and simply built more trucks to compensate. German systems followed strict military procedures because deviation from doctrine could create chaos in a resource-constrained environment. Americans improvised continuously because their abundance of resources meant failures could be overcome through redundancy rather than precision. The numbers achieved by the Red Ball Express during its first week of operation defied every German calculation of what was logistically possible. From August 25th through August 31st, a mere 7 days, American trucks delivered 89,939 tons of supplies to forward units. The daily average reached 12,848 tons, exceeding the initial target that German analysts had dismissed as propaganda. The round-trip distance that each truck covered averaged 686 miles, from the beaches at Normandy to Patton's forward positions and back. With 5,958 trucks making an average of 1.5 trips daily, the operation moved over 27,000 tons of cargo daily when you counted both directions. The fuel consumed by the operation itself, not the fuel being delivered, but the fuel burned by the trucks performing the delivery, exceeded 300,000 gallons per day. German logistics specialists who captured these figures from American documents initially dismissed them as propaganda intended to mislead or demoralize. But as more intelligence accumulated, as more observation reports confirmed the continuous flow of vehicles, as more interrogated American prisoners casually mentioned the red ball as if it were routine, German commanders were forced to accept that these impossible numbers were real, and they were accelerating. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had established a rhythm that seemed to mock every principle German logistics officers had learned in decades of military service. Convoys departed every 5 minutes from the western terminus at the beaches and from Cherbourg. Each convoy averaged 67 vehicles, though this number fluctuated based on availability and need. The standard load per vehicle was 5 tons, but drivers routinely overloaded their trucks to 7 tons or more when critical supplies were needed urgently. The time required to cover 350 miles one-way averaged 14 hours, an achievement that required maintaining speeds over 25 miles per hour constantly despite damaged roads, occasional German stragglers, and the inherent mechanical limitations of heavily loaded trucks. Turnaround time at each end of the route, where trucks were unloaded and reloaded, had been streamlined to approximately 2 hours through brutal efficiency. At any given moment, day or night, approximately 5,000 vehicles were in constant motion on the Red Ball routes. This wasn't a supply line in any traditional sense. It was a mechanical river, flowing continuously, never stopping, never slowing, carrying the material lifeblood of American armies forward, while simultaneously returning empty vessels to be refilled and sent forward again in an endless cycle that consumed resources at rates that would have bankrupted any European military but barely strained American industrial capacity. The Red Ball Express generated innovations on an hourly basis, as drivers and mechanics solved problems that German military science considered insurmountable. When trucks broke down, and approximately 1,800 vehicles per day experienced some form of mechanical failure, mobile maintenance units performed repairs directly on the roadside. These units, positioned every 50 miles along the route, had developed a triage system of brutal efficiency. 15 minutes to assess and repair or push the vehicle off the road. There was no time for proper diagnosis, no opportunity for careful mechanical work. Parts were cannibalized from vehicles deemed unrepairable without any paperwork or authorization. Engines were swapped in 45 minutes, using mobile cranes and techniques that would have horrified factory-trained mechanics. Entire transmissions were replaced using parts harvested from wrecks. When the designated Red Bull route became congested, despite all efforts to maintain flow, drivers created alternate paths without waiting for authorization from headquarters. They commandeered French civilian buses to move personnel, freeing up military trucks for cargo transport. They took possession of captured German vehicles, painted them olive drab, and pressed them into service without bothering to change the German instruments or controls. They built improvised bypasses around destroyed bridges, using rubble from bombed buildings as roadbed, constructing temporary routes that lasted just long enough to keep the convoys moving before being abandoned when better alternatives emerged. The Germans, observing this organized chaos from their retreating positions, struggled to comprehend how such apparent disorder could produce such remarkable results. German logistics doctrine emphasized careful planning, maintenance schedules drafted months in advance, and proper procedures for every conceivable situation. Deviation from established protocols was discouraged, even punished, because in a resource-constrained environment, improvisation often led to waste. The Americans violated every principle, yet their system accelerated rather than collapsed. The contradiction was incomprehensible to minds trained in Prussian military efficiency. Perhaps most stunning for German observers was American fuel management. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just for its own operations, not counting the millions of gallons it delivered to combat units. This single logistics operation burned more fuel than many German armies received for all purposes combined. Yet fuel never ran short. The Americans had created a parallel marvel that German intelligence hadn't even detected until it was operational. Operation Pluto, an acronym for pipelines under the ocean. By September 1944, fuel flowed through underwater pipelines laid across the English Channel from Britain to France. These pipelines, a technological achievement German engineers had considered impossible, delivered fuel directly to French ports without requiring tanker ships that could be sunk by submarines. Forward fuel dumps were established every 25 miles along the Red Ball route, ensuring no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes for refueling. Tanker trucks ran their own parallel convoy system, a supply line supplying the supply line, maintaining the fuel dumps that kept the cargo trucks moving. General Major Walter Wehrmacht, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, observed from aerial reconnaissance photographs taken at great risk by the few remaining Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. The Americans have fuel dumps larger than our entire strategic reserves. They burn more gasoline moving gasoline than we allocate to entire panzer divisions. This isn't war as we understand it. It's industrial overflow. Wehrmacht had identified the core reality. America wasn't fighting a resource-constrained war. American industry produced such abundance that waste became acceptable, even encouraged, if it increased operational speed. This represented a fundamental paradigm shift in military thinking that German commanders trained in resource conservation simply couldn't internalize. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply Patton's advance, it multiplied the speed of that advance exponentially in ways that shattered German defensive planning. Traditional German military doctrine, developed over decades and proven in multiple conflicts, calculated that an armored division could sustain an advance of 20 to 30 miles daily under optimal conditions. This calculation factored in combat operations, mechanical maintenance, supply distribution, and the human need for rest. Patton's divisions, supplied by the Red Ball Express, averaged 40 to 60 miles daily for weeks at a time, doubling the speed German doctrine considered maximum possible. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles during morning operations through light resistance. At noon, they halted for resupply as doctrine required, but instead of waiting hours or days for supply columns to catch up, Red Ball trucks were already waiting at the predetermined resupply point with fuel and ammunition. The division advanced another 32 miles that afternoon, a 67-mile single-day advance that shattered every German assumption about the pace of mechanized warfare. German defensive planning assumed maximum 30-mile daily advances, positioning reserve units accordingly. When American forces doubled that speed, German reserves found themselves bypassed before they could even engage. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, reviewing intelligence reports in East Prussia and widely considered the father of German armored warfare, initially refused to believe them. No armored force can advance 60 miles daily for a week. Mechanical failures alone prevent it, regardless of supply availability. This is propaganda or misidentification of units. But intercepted American radio traffic, which the Americans broadcast openly without even basic encryption, confirmed the reports. More disturbing for German commanders, the Americans were announcing their positions freely, seemingly supremely confident in their ability to move faster than Germans could react. By September 5, 1944, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive reports on the Red Ball Express, and the implications were catastrophic for Wehrmacht planning. Every fundamental assumption about American military capability required immediate and complete revision. The intelligence report contained observations that defied German military science and challenged everything Prussian military tradition had taught. Americans were wasting vehicles prodigiously, abandoning damaged trucks rather than investing time and resources in repairs. Drivers operated on stimulants, primarily benzodrine, for days at a time, violating every principle of personnel management that emphasized regular rest and rotation. There was no camouflage discipline whatsoever, making the entire system theoretically vulnerable to air attack that never materialized, because the Luftwaffe had been so thoroughly defeated that it couldn't exploit this obvious vulnerability. Mechanical failure rates reached 30% daily, a figure that should have paralyzed the operation, but were simply overwhelmed by redundancy and replacement. Fuel consumption rates would have bankrupted any European military within weeks, but barely registered as a concern in American planning. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B and considered one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, drafted a response that revealed the growing desperation in German strategic thinking. If these reports are accurate, and I believe they are, we face not merely a superior army but a superior civilization. They make no effort to hide their operations because they don't fear us. They waste resources because they possess effectively infinite resources. We cannot defeat this with military tactics alone. We are fighting not an army but an industrial system that has been weaponized. Model had grasped what many of his colleagues still refused to accept. The Red Ball Express represented something more profound than clever logistics. It represented the complete industrialization of warfare, where victory belonged not to the most tactically brilliant commanders or the most courageous soldiers, but to the nation that could deliver the most supplies the fastest across the greatest distances. In this new paradigm of industrial warfare, Germany had already lost, regardless of how many battles its soldiers won or how skillfully its generals maneuvered their diminishing forces. The Red Ball Express drivers themselves paid a physical and psychological price that German observers, focused on the mechanical aspects of the operation, couldn't see from their distant observation posts. Drivers operated for 72 straight hours routinely, pushing far beyond the limits of human endurance. They hallucinated from exhaustion and benzodrine, seeing phantom obstacles on dark roads, watching trees march across highways, fighting to keep their eyes open and their trucks on the road. Accidents killed 300 drivers during the Red Ball's operational period, men who died not in combat, but in the service of keeping the supplies flowing. Trucks collided in fog when exhausted drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Vehicles overturned on damaged roads when drivers misjudged curves they could barely see. Trucks burst into flames when overheated engines, pushed beyond their design limits, ignited cargo or fuel lines. Yet morale among these drivers remained extraordinarily high, sustained by a sense of purpose that transcended the physical hardships they endured. These men, mostly African Americans, systematically denied equal rights in their home country, understood with perfect clarity that they were making history with every mile they drove. They were proving Adolf Hitler's racial theories catastrophically wrong with every ton they delivered. They were demonstrating to skeptical white officers, to doubting American civilians, and most importantly to themselves, that given the tools and the opportunity, they could match or exceed anyone's performance. The Red Ball Express became their combat, their battlefield, and they were winning decisively. Captured German officers, interrogated by American intelligence personnel, provided eloquent testimony to the Red Ball Express's psychological impact on Wehrmacht morale and strategic thinking. Oberst Hans von Luck, a highly regarded panzer officer taken prisoner in September 1944, told his interrogators with the careful honesty of a professional soldier, acknowledging superior opposition. "We knew we had lost the war when we finally understood your supply system. You violate every rule we were taught. You waste fuel, abandon vehicles, exhaust your drivers to the point of collapse, yet you succeed through sheer volume and industrial capacity. You have industrialized warfare beyond our ability to comprehend or counter." The psychological impact on German forces in contact with American units went beyond mere demoralization. Wehrmacht soldiers could hear American trucks throughout every night, an endless symphony of motors that never stopped, never slowed, never gave them the respite that exhausted men desperately needed. Those endless motors represented endless supplies. German soldiers counted their remaining rifle ammunition in individual rounds, often possessing only 3 or 4 bullets per man, while Americans were bringing literally millions of rounds forward in those trucks that rumbled past all night. The sound itself became a form of psychological warfare more effective than propaganda broadcasts. Lying in foxholes in the darkness, German soldiers would count the vehicles passing and calculate the tonnage being delivered, and realize with growing despair that they were fighting an opponent who possessed such overwhelming material superiority that courage and skill couldn't compensate. The vehicles themselves amazed German engineers who had opportunities to examine captured or abandoned Red Ball trucks. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, the absolute backbone of the Red Ball Express, represented the perfection of mass production applied to military vehicles. General Motors had produced over 500,000 of these vehicles by war's end, more trucks of a single type than the entire German military possessed of all types combined, including civilian vehicles pressed into military service. The Deuce and a Half, as soldiers universally called it, featured innovations that German vehicles hadn't implemented despite Germany's reputation for engineering excellence. All-wheel drive was standard equipment, not a special feature reserved for particular models. Automatic tire inflation systems maintained proper pressure even when tires were damaged by shrapnel or debris. Waterproofing allowed 30-inch water fording without preparation or special equipment. Engines ran reliably on low-quality fuel without modification or adjustment. Heaters actually functioned effectively in winter, a seemingly minor detail that German soldiers, who had frozen in Russian winters while their vehicle heaters failed, appreciated with bitter envy. More stunning than the vehicles themselves was American maintenance philosophy, which represented a completely different approach to mechanical logistics. Where German doctrine emphasized rebuilding engines to extend vehicle life, Americans simply removed failed engines and installed new ones from stock. Where Germans carefully rationed spare parts because replacements took months to arrive from factories in Germany, Americans discarded entire vehicles for minor problems because new trucks arrived weekly at French ports from American factories. Where Germans relied on a small number of highly trained master mechanics who could diagnose and repair complex problems, Americans trained thousands of competent mechanics who could perform 80% of repairs quickly, leaving the remaining 20% of problems to be solved by installing replacement components or abandoning the vehicle entirely. As the front lines moved steadily eastward through September, the Red Ball Express adapted with a speed that stunned German planning officers who were accustomed to logistics changes requiring weeks of careful preparation and coordination. When the original route to Chartres became insufficient to handle increased traffic volume and extended distances, Americans created Red Ball Express extensions literally overnight. The White Ball Express ran from Rouen to Paris. The Green Diamond route connected Cherbourg to railroad transfer points. The Red Lion route supplied forces moving toward Belgium. The ABC route, an acronym for Antwerp, Brussels, Charleroi, supplied the northernmost Allied forces. Each new route was operational within 48 hours of conception, a speed of implementation that German staff officers found incomprehensible. German logistics required weeks of planning to modify existing supply routes. Americans simply painted new route markers, assigned truck companies, issued minimal instructions, and started rolling. The predominance of African-American drivers in the Red Ball Express created profound cognitive dissonance for German soldiers and officers indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology. Nazi doctrine declared blacks racially inferior, incapable of technical tasks requiring intelligence, lacking the initiative necessary for military operations. Yet these supposedly inferior drivers were performing logistics miracles that the vaunted Wehrmacht, the military force of the self-proclaimed master race, couldn't match or counter. The African-American soldiers understood this irony perfectly and found it grimly satisfying. They knew exactly what the Nazis thought of them, what Nazi racial theories proclaimed about their capabilities, and this knowledge made them push even harder. Every mile they drove proved Hitler wrong. They were fighting racism with truck keys and tire chains, defeating Nazi ideology through superior performance, demonstrating through action what words could never convey. That racist theories were not merely morally wrong but factually incorrect. Some German prisoners forced to work as laborers loading Red Bull trucks under guard found their entire worldview shattered by working alongside African-American sergeants and officers. These prisoners discovered black sergeants who could calculate complex weight distributions faster than German engineers with university educations. They encountered black soldiers who spoke better English than the German army's English instructors, contradicting propaganda about black intellectual inferiority. They were treated fairly by black guards and supervisors, despite everything Nazi propaganda had told them about how racially inferior peoples supposedly behaved when given authority. These experiences, multiplied across thousands of German prisoners, planted seeds of doubt about Nazi ideology that would influence post-war German society in ways no one anticipated in 1944. The Red Ball Express required infrastructure the German engineers deemed impossible to create under active combat conditions. American combat engineers built or substantially reinforced 40 bridges, created 15 major fuel depots capable of storing millions of gallons, established 26 maintenance stations, equipped to repair hundreds of vehicles simultaneously, and constructed 8 temporary cities complete with housing, mess halls, and recreation facilities for drivers rotating through rest periods. All of this infrastructure was built while the operation was actively running, while trucks rolled past construction sites day and night, while German forces occasionally shelled or bombed rear areas, while the front lines remained fluid and dangerous. The bridge at Montmirail provided a perfect example of American engineering speed versus German assumptions. German engineers had destroyed this bridge specifically to sever American supply lines, calculating that replacement would require a minimum of 6 weeks using conventional military engineering methods. This calculation was reasonable based on European precedent and standard engineering practice. American engineers built a temporary bridge capable of supporting loaded trucks in 14 hours, working around the clock, while Red Ball convoys simply detoured 8 miles on hastily bulldozed bypass roads that were abandoned once the bridge reopened. German engineers who observed American construction methods from concealed positions or through reconnaissance reports couldn't comprehend the apparent chaos that produced such rapid results. There were no extended planning meetings, no detailed blueprints drawn to scale, no careful calculations of load-bearing capacity. American engineers simply assessed the problem, gathered materials, and started building, making design decisions on site as they worked. They built faster than Germans could destroy infrastructure, created new supply routes faster than Germans could block them, adapted to changing conditions faster than German planning cycles could even recognize problems. One Red Ball Express achievement particularly stunned German artillery officers trained in the careful mathematics of ammunition supply. American artillery units fired without restriction, expending ammunition at rates that no German unit had enjoyed since early 1942, when the Wehrmacht still had access to abundant supplies. During the reduction of Metz fortifications in September 1944, the 12th Corps Artillery fired 100,000 rounds in 24 hours, a bombardment of staggering intensity. The Red Ball Express delivered every single one of those rounds, plus a 20% surplus, ensuring the guns never fell silent for lack of ammunition. German artillery defending Metz was strictly rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day, and even that allowance couldn't always be guaranteed. The disparity was psychologically overwhelming for German gunners. American guns fired continuously for hours, while German artillery officers made agonizing calculations about which targets merited their scarce ammunition. German observers calculated that such intensive American bombardments required 50 truckloads of ammunition arriving every hour. The Red Ball Express provided exactly that volume without any indication of strain or shortage. The Red Ball Express consumed vehicles at rates that would have paralyzed any other military force in history. By late September 1944, mechanical attrition had reached staggering proportions that would have represented a catastrophic crisis for German logistics. The average vehicle lifespan on the Red Ball had dropped to 10,000 miles compared to the normal expected life of 30,000 miles for similar trucks operating under standard conditions. The daily deadline rate, the percentage of vehicles unavailable due to mechanical problems, reached 30% of all vehicles in the system, meaning nearly 2,000 trucks were inoperative on any given day. Engines were being replaced at a rate of 500 per week, worn out by constant high-speed operation with heavy loads. Tires were consumed at 10,000 per week, destroyed by overloading, poor roads, and the constant operation that gave rubber no time to cool. Over 5,000 vehicles were completely destroyed or abandoned during the operation, written off as total losses and left beside French roads or pushed into ditches. Yet despite these catastrophic attrition rates, the operation never slowed. American industrial production had not merely anticipated such losses, but had planned for them and provided for them. Liberty ships arrived weekly at French ports, carrying hundreds of new trucks straight from American factories. Replacement drivers were trained in a mere 2 days at hastily established schools and immediately thrown into convoys. German logistics officers calculated that Americans were destroying more trucks weekly than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the Western theater. Yet American transport capacity increased rather than decreased because new trucks arrived faster than old trucks failed. They had achieved something German military science had declared theoretically impossible, a logistics system that operated faster than its own consumption rate. French civilians living along the Red Ball routes witnessed American material abundance that contradicted 4 years of German occupation, characterized by increasingly severe scarcity. The psychological impact on occupied populations was immediate and profound, influencing resistance activities and civilian morale. Red Ball Express drivers, particularly African-American soldiers who often felt more kinship with oppressed European civilians than with their own segregated society, frequently shared their rations with French families, despite regulations forbidding such distributions. At every stop, French children would gather, and drivers would casually give them chocolate bars, cigarettes for their parents, soap that had become precious during occupation, canned goods that represented luxury to people who had lived on rationed food for years. The contrast with German occupation couldn't have been more stark. Americans gave away casually as personal kindness items that Germans had rationed strictly as state policy. German intelligence services reported with alarm the propaganda impact of this casual generosity. French civilians now believe American victory is inevitable. They cite the endless truck convoys as proof of overwhelming material superiority. Resistance activity has increased by 400% along Red Ball routes as civilians gain confidence that liberation is permanent. The population that accepted our occupation as fait accompli now actively opposes it, based on evidence that Germany cannot match American logistics. In early September 1944, the Red Ball Express faced what should have been an insurmountable crisis. Patton's Third Army had advanced so far eastward, had moved so fast and so far, that even the remarkable Red Ball struggled to maintain required supply rates. The round-trip distance now exceeded 700 miles. Drivers were quite literally collapsing from exhaustion despite benzodrine. Vehicles were disintegrating mechanically from the constant strain. German intelligence detected clear signs of system strain and predicted imminent collapse. General Lieutenant Hasso von Manteuffel, who would soon command the 5th Panzer Army in the Battle of the Bulge, reported with carefully restrained optimism on September 8th. American supply lines show unmistakable signs of approaching collapse. Convoy intervals have increased from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. Vehicle speeds have visibly decreased. We are observing increasing numbers of abandoned trucks. This represents our opportunity to counterattack before they can recover. But American adaptability, that quality German officers consistently underestimated, again surprised them. Within 72 hours, the Red Ball Express had completely reorganized its operations to address the crisis. They created intermediate transfer points, where loaded trucks from the beaches met empty trucks from forward areas, cutting individual driver runs from 700 miles to 350 miles and allowing faster turnaround. They implemented systematic driver rotation, finally acknowledging that even American soldiers had physical limits. They established forward maintenance bases closer to the front lines where major repairs could be performed without trucks having to return to rear areas. Most significantly, they simply doubled the number of assigned vehicles, accepting that if 7,000 trucks were needed instead of 6,000, then American industry would provide 7,000. By September 12th, just 4 days after German intelligence predicted collapse, tonnage delivery rates had actually increased beyond previous levels. The crisis that should have halted Patton's advance only made the system stronger, more resilient, more capable. Supplementing the Red Ball Express ground transportation, Americans implemented another logistics solution that Germans deemed operationally impossible at this scale. Large-scale aerial supply operations using transport aircraft began delivering critical supplies directly to forward units, bypassing ground transportation entirely for the most urgent requirements. Each C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft could carry approximately 3 tons of high-priority cargo. On September 16, 1944, Wehrmacht observers counted over 900 individual transport flights in a single day, delivering 2,700 tons of supplies by air without requiring any ground vehicles or roads. The Luftwaffe, at its absolute peak capability during the Stalingrad airlift, had managed to deliver 300 tons daily and had considered that effort a maximum exertion that couldn't be sustained. The Americans were delivering 9 times that tonnage and treating it as routine supplementary logistics rather than maximum effort. Americans used transport aircraft the way other nations use trucks, without apparent concern for fuel costs, without fighter escort concerns despite theoretical Luftwaffe threat, without the elaborate planning that German air logistics required. They simply loaded planes, flew them to forward airstrips, unloaded them, and flew them back for more cargo. They assumed some losses to enemy action or accidents, and overwhelmed those losses with sheer numbers. The Wehrmacht couldn't even conceptualize competing with this arithmetic of industrial abundance. The Red Ball Express operated under command principles that fundamentally violated German military hierarchy and doctrine. Junior officers, lieutenants, and captains routinely made operational decisions that would have required general officer approval in the Wehrmacht. Sergeants commanded logistics operations larger and more complex than German colonels typically managed. This radical decentralization of authority baffled German observers, who were trained in rigid hierarchical structures where decisions flowed from the top down through carefully defined channels. American logistics appeared to operate without central control, without the coordinating headquarters that German doctrine deemed absolutely essential for complex operations. Every American lieutenant seemed to act with the authority of a general, every sergeant with the independence of a colonel. By traditional military logic, chaos should have resulted from this lack of centralized control. Instead, Americans achieved efficiency that the Wehrmacht couldn't match, despite its rigid, carefully structured hierarchy. The difference lay in American military culture that emphasized mission accomplishment over procedural compliance, that trained junior leaders to make independent decisions rather than await instructions, that accepted some errors in execution as acceptable cost of operational speed. Germans had developed their hierarchical system over centuries and considered it essential to military effectiveness. Americans had developed their decentralized approach from frontier experience and industrial management and considered it essential to operational flexibility. The two systems represented fundamentally different philosophies of organization, and in the test of total war, the American approach was proving superior, not because it was more elegant or theoretically sound, but simply because it produced better results faster. By October 1944, advancing Allied rail operations began gradually reducing Red Ball Express requirements as combat engineers restored French rail lines and locomotives to operation. The Red Ball operation that military planners had originally estimated would last perhaps 10 days had continued for 82 days, delivering 412,000 tons of supplies across 122 million ton miles, a figure that represented the total tonnage multiplied by the distance it traveled. German commanders, now fighting desperately on their own borders as Allied forces approached Germany itself, paused in their struggle to reflect on what they had witnessed during those 82 days. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B until his suicide in April 1945, wrote in one of his final operational reports, "We were not defeated primarily by American tanks, which we could match, or American planes, which we could sometimes counter. We were defeated by American trucks, against which we had no defense and no counter." The Red Ball Express proved conclusively that in modern warfare, logistics is strategy. The nation that can supply its armies ultimately defeats the nation that can merely fight well. The transition from truck transport to rail transport was itself a logistical marvel that deserved study. American railroad engineers had reconstructed over 1,000 miles of deliberately destroyed French rail lines, while the Red Ball Express was actively running, working simultaneously on 2 massive logistics projects. They laid new track faster than Germans had destroyed the original lines, often incorporating captured German rail equipment and even German prisoners trained as railroad workers. The final Red Ball Express operational statistics, compiled when the operation officially concluded on November 16, 1944, defied every German calculation of logistical possibility. 82 days of continuous operation. 412,193 tons of supplies delivered to forward units. 222 million ton-miles of cargo transported. 5,958 vehicles operating on average, with peak utilization reaching 7,000 vehicles. 23,000 total drivers employed in rotating assignments. 700,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily just for Red Ball operations. 40,000 tons of ammunition delivered specifically to Patton's Third Army. 15 million individual rations transported and distributed. 135,000 tons of medical supplies moved forward to save wounded soldiers of all nationalities. Reviewing these compiled figures while in Allied captivity after the war, German officers admitted that they had fundamentally miscalculated American logistics based on European precedent and German experience. They had studied their own best logistical performances, multiplied those achievements by a factor of 3 to account for American industrial advantages, and assumed that represented the maximum American capability. They had been wrong by a factor of 10. Their estimates hadn't merely been inaccurate, they had been operating in an entirely different conceptual framework that couldn't account for American approaches to industrial warfare. Beyond the raw tonnage and distances, beyond the impressive statistics and unprecedented scale, the Red Ball Express achieved something more profound and lasting than mere supply delivery. It destroyed German faith in their own military and technological superiority, that core assumption that had enabled German forces to fight on despite increasingly desperate circumstances. Wehrmacht officers who had professionally dismissed Americans as mechanically dependent but tactically soft, who had laughed at American logistics as wasteful and undisciplined, watched those same Americans achieve logistics miracles through determination, improvisation, and industrial abundance that rendered German efficiency irrelevant. German prisoners of war in camps near Red Ball routes would stand silently at prison camp fences for hours, watching the endless convoys roll past, counting trucks, calculating tonnage, understanding the implications. Some prisoners wept openly, not from immediate physical hardship, but from the crushing realization of what those trucks represented. They were witnessing not merely American ability to supply their armies, but American ability to waste more resources than Germans could produce, even with maximum effort. They were watching their entire worldview collapse, one passing truck at a time, as the evidence before their eyes demolished every assumption about German superiority and American weakness that Nazi propaganda had fed them for years. The Red Ball Express forced an unexpected racial reckoning within the American military itself, creating pressures that would contribute to post-war desegregation and civil rights progress. The operation's overwhelming success depended almost entirely on African American soldiers who were still rigorously segregated, systematically denied equal treatment throughout the military and society, and officially barred from combat roles based on racist assumptions about their courage and capability. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited Red Ball operations in September 1944 and witnessed this fundamental contradiction firsthand between American democratic rhetoric and American racial practice. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded in his diary, "The general stood watching colored drivers who had been operating continuously for 20 hours straight, exhausted men who nevertheless kept their vehicles moving. He turned to me and said quietly, 'These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry division assaulting a fortified position. We need to fundamentally reconsider many things about how this army operates and who we allow to serve in what capacities.'" The Red Ball's success created undeniable evidence and political pressure for military integration that contributed significantly to President Truman's executive order desegregating the armed forces just 3 years later in 1947. African American soldiers had proved in France what they had always known, but what white America had refused to acknowledge. Given the tools, the training, and the opportunity, they would match or exceed anyone's performance in any role. The Red Ball Express was their combat operation, their battlefield, and they had won it decisively against both Nazi Germany and American racial prejudice simultaneously. German racial theorists and SS ideologues struggled desperately to explain away this contradiction between Nazi racial science and observed reality. SS publications on racial theory simply stopped mentioning American logistics operations entirely because the evidence was too overwhelming to explain within Nazi ideology and too damaging to acknowledge publicly. How could the master race explain being defeated by people their ideology declared racially inferior? The cognitive dissonance proved irresolvable, so Nazi propaganda simply ignored it, hoping German soldiers and civilians wouldn't notice or wouldn't understand the implications. German military engineers and logistics officers studied Red Ball Express operations with great intensity after the war concluded, seeking to understand both their defeat and the principles that might guide future military logistics. The lessons they extracted revolutionized logistics thinking worldwide and influenced NATO military doctrine throughout the Cold War. They learned that volume and redundancy could overcome apparent inefficiency, that mechanical abundance could eliminate traditional vulnerability to supply line interdiction, that decentralized execution enabled operational speed impossible under centralized control, that standardization of vehicles and parts multiplied overall capability, and that human endurance limits were substantially higher than peacetime assumptions suggested when soldiers believed in their mission. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff and one of the Wehrmacht's finest strategic minds, wrote in his post-war analysis published in 1950, "The Red Ball Express proved conclusively that logistics determines strategy, not vice versa, as traditional military theory taught. Americans understood this principle instinctively, perhaps because their national experience emphasized industrial development and continental expansion. We Germans learned this lesson too late, after we had already lost the war through our failure to solve the logistical limitations of blitzkrieg warfare." Among the 23,000 Red Ball drivers, individual stories of extraordinary heroism emerged that Germans found incomprehensible within their rigid military framework of medals and formal recognition. These stories, verified through military records and witness statements, revealed American military culture to observing Germans in ways that official doctrine never could. Corporal John L. Houston drove his truck continuously for 48 hours straight, delivering critically needed ammunition to the 2nd Armored Division at Cambrai, falling asleep at the wheel 3 separate times, but continuing after being physically revived by other drivers who recognized his determination. Private Booker T. Washington's truck caught fire from overheated brakes while carrying medical supplies desperately needed at a forward field hospital. Instead of abandoning the burning vehicle as both procedure and common sense required, he drove that flaming truck 2 miles to reach the field hospital, jumping out only as flames reached the cab. The medical supplies he delivered under these circumstances saved the lives of wounded soldiers from both American and German armies. These individual stories of extraordinary dedication, multiplied across thousands of similar incidents throughout the operation, revealed American military culture to German observers. Germans saw soldiers demonstrating individual initiative beyond what regulations required, calculated risk-taking in service of mission accomplishment, and prioritization of objectives over regulatory compliance. This cultural difference proved as significant as any material advantage in determining operational outcomes. Desperately, German forces attempted to create their own version of the Red Ball Express in late 1944 during preparations for the Ardennes offensive, the operation Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. Operation Grief included detailed plans for captured American trucks to create German supply lines using American methods and American vehicles. The effort failed almost immediately and comprehensively, revealing that logistics superiority couldn't simply be copied without the underlying industrial and cultural foundations. German drivers couldn't maintain American operational speeds because they lacked both the vehicles and the training. German mechanics couldn't repair American equipment quickly enough because they didn't have access to the mountains of spare parts American logistics assumed. German fuel supplies couldn't sustain American-level consumption rates because German oil production was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Most fundamentally, Germans couldn't replicate the American attitude of treating resources as abundant and replaceable rather than scarce and precious. Oberst Otto Skorzeny, commanding special operations during the Battle of the Bulge, reported with frustration, "We captured over 50 American trucks in excellent condition. Within 1 week, 30 were completely deadlined with mechanical failures. Americans would have simply replaced them with new vehicles from their endless reserves. We attempted to repair them using our limited parts and trained mechanics. That fundamental difference in approach and available resources explains our ultimate defeat more clearly than any tactical analysis." The winter of 1944-45 provided the Red Ball Express's ultimate operational test. Freezing rain, heavy snow and ice should have stopped wheeled transport entirely according to German doctrine. Wehrmacht logistics manuals stated explicitly that wheeled vehicle logistics became operationally impossible below -10 degrees Celsius, requiring either tracked vehicles or simply accepting that supply operations would cease until weather improved. Yet the Red Ball Express continued operating throughout the winter, with only modest modifications. Drivers wrapped chains on tires for traction on icy roads. They poured alcohol into radiators to prevent freezing. They kept rolling despite conditions that paralyzed German logistics. Average speeds dropped dramatically from 35 miles per hour to 15 miles per hour, but tonnage delivery continued without interruption. German observers reported with amazement ice-covered American convoys moving through blizzards that had completely stopped panzer divisions. The Americans had created a logistics system that functioned regardless of weather conditions, terrain obstacles, or enemy action. It wasn't elegant by German aesthetic standards, it wasn't efficient by German engineering principles, but it was absolutely unstoppable by any means the Wehrmacht could employ. In May 1945, immediately after German surrender, captured German logistics officers were required by Allied intelligence services to study Red Ball Express operations for historical records and lessons learned analysis. Their conclusions, compiled from interviews and written statements, were unanimous and utterly devastating to German military pride and assumptions. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schulz, who had commanded logistics for Army Group Center, summarized with remarkable candor, "The Red Ball Express represents a form of warfare we never imagined possible. Americans created what amounted to a temporary civilization, a complete society of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of supplies that existed solely to feed advancing armies, then dissolved instantly when no longer operationally necessary. We Germans built permanent infrastructure over years of careful planning. Americans created superior temporary systems in days through improvisation and industrial capacity. This difference determined the war's outcome." The most insightful analysis came from General Heinz Guderian, the officer widely credited as the father of German armored warfare and blitzkrieg doctrine. His post-war assessment acknowledged fundamental German failure. "We Germans invented blitzkrieg. We pioneered mechanized warfare. We revolutionized combined arms operations, but we never solved blitzkrieg's fundamental limitation. Logistics couldn't keep pace with tactical success. Americans solved this limitation through industrial excess we had deemed both impossible and wasteful. The Red Ball Express was not merely a supply line in any traditional sense. It was a flowing mechanical river of material that ultimately drowned our forces regardless of their tactical skill or strategic positioning." The Red Ball Express cost the United States approximately $100 million in 1944 currency, a staggering sum that included vehicles destroyed through operation, fuel consumed beyond normal allocation, French roads damaged by heavy traffic, and French civilian claims for property damage. German staff officers, trained throughout their careers in managing severe resource scarcity, found this expenditure incomprehensible and wasteful. Yet American strategic planners considered it remarkably economical. The operation enabled the capture of over 400,000 German soldiers, the liberation of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and military historians estimate it shortened the European war by approximately 6 months. Each day of continued war cost America approximately $250 million in direct expenses. By that calculation, the Red Ball Express paid for itself completely in a single day of shortened conflict, making it one of the most cost-effective military operations in history despite its apparent wastefulness. Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, who commanded all logistics operations for the European theater, stated in his post-war memoir, "We wore out 5,000 trucks and exhausted 23,000 men to achieve the destruction of German military power in France. In any previous war in human history, those vehicle losses and that personnel exhaustion would represent catastrophic failure. In American industrial warfare, it represents acceptable operational overhead, the cost of doing business at the scale modern warfare requires." An unexpected long-term consequence of the Red Ball Express was its revolutionary impact on post-war civilian logistics and commercial transportation. Thousands of drivers returned to America after the war with direct personal experience operating the world's largest and most efficient transportation network. These veterans possessed practical knowledge and proven skills that made them invaluable in the rapidly expanding American economy. Many founded trucking companies that became industry leaders. Yellow Freight, Roadway Express, and Consolidated Freightways were among the major trucking companies started or significantly built by Red Ball Express veterans who applied military logistics principles to civilian commerce. They had learned in France that volume beats efficiency when speed matters, that keeping vehicles moving constantly produces better results than careful scheduling, and that if you can keep trucks rolling 24 hours daily, you can move the world's goods. These principles revolutionized American commercial logistics and contributed significantly to post-war economic growth. Military historians universally recognize the Red Ball Express as the single most decisive logistics operation of the European theater. Without it, professional consensus holds that Patton's advance would have stalled in late August or early September. Paris would have fallen to Allied forces weeks later than it actually did, and German forces would have successfully established winter defensive lines that might have prolonged the war into 1946. The operation validated emerging American military doctrine that emphasized logistics over tactics, that prioritized material superiority over battlefield maneuver. While German officers studied Clausewitz and Napoleon, analyzing battlefield tactics and strategic theory, American officers increasingly studied Detroit assembly lines, railroad timetables, and industrial management principles. The Red Ball Express demonstrated conclusively that in modern industrial warfare, the ability to supply forces consistently determines victory more certainly than tactical brilliance or strategic genius. On September 15, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had been recalled from retirement to serve as Supreme German Commander in the West, received comprehensive intelligence reports on Red Ball Express operations. After studying these reports for several hours in silence, contemplating their implications for German strategic options, he summoned his staff officers for a frank assessment. "Gentlemen," he announced with the weary authority of a career soldier facing unpleasant truth, "we face something that cannot be solved through military means alone. The Americans have created a supply system that effectively makes distance irrelevant as a defensive factor. Our entire defensive strategy assumed a culminating point where advancing enemy forces would inevitably outrun their supplies, creating opportunities for our counterattacks. That culminating point does not exist in American logistics. They have fundamentally revolutionized warfare's relationship to supply and distance, and we are fighting the previous war, while they fight the next one." His operations officer, Oberst Hans Speidel, who would survive the war to become a NATO commander, suggested desperately attempting to interdict the Red Ball routes with the Luftwaffe's remaining operational aircraft. Von Rundstedt's response revealed his complete understanding of the strategic situation's hopelessness. "Interdict with what aircraft, Colonel? They operate 6,000 trucks on those routes. If we somehow manage to destroy 1,000 trucks, which our remaining air power absolutely cannot accomplish, they would replace those losses in 1 week from their production. We would need to destroy 200 trucks daily, merely to match their replacement rate." We don't possess 200 operational aircraft in total for the entire Western Front. This is not a military problem. This is an industrial capacity problem, and that war was lost before it began. Behind the overwhelming statistics were human stories that revealed American national character to German observers in ways that numbers never could. These stories, accumulated from thousands of individual incidents throughout the operation's 82 days, created a mythology that profoundly demoralized German forces. Stories of drivers who hadn't slept for 3 consecutive days, refusing relief offers because they believed their particular truck might not make it through with a different driver. Mechanics working in freezing autumn rain to keep convoys rolling when they could have legitimately sought shelter. Teenagers who had lied about their age to enlist now driving trucks through combat zones because they believed in the mission. Such stories multiplied throughout the operation and spreading through word of mouth among both American and German soldiers created powerful narrative that undermined German morale. The Americans were demonstrably not the soft, pampered society that Nazi propaganda had portrayed. They drove themselves harder than Germans drove their horses. They accepted casualties and hardship that would have devastated morale in other armies, but they did it voluntarily through commitment rather than from fear of punishment. This voluntary dedication made them far more dangerous than German doctrine had anticipated. Totalitarian systems understood compulsion and fear. They had no framework for understanding the power of soldiers who fought and worked because they chose to, because they believed their cause was just. The Red Ball Express became unintentional psychological warfare more powerful than any planned propaganda operation. German soldiers positioned anywhere within several miles of Red Ball routes could hear the convoys operating throughout every night, endless streams of motors that never stopped, never paused, never gave exhausted defenders the respite they desperately needed. The sound itself functioned as psychological warfare that degraded German combat effectiveness. Wehrmacht units reported hearing convoys even when no trucks were actually present nearby. Phantom sounds that demoralized troops as effectively as actual logistics operations. The mere knowledge that Americans possessed unlimited supplies, while Germans carefully rationed their last ammunition, created a despair that undermined combat effectiveness more surely than any tactical defeat. American psychological warfare units, recognizing this unintended effect, began deliberately broadcasting recorded truck engine sounds toward German lines during periods when actual convoys weren't operating nearby. German units reported these phantom convoys as real in their intelligence reports, demonstrating the profound psychological damage the Red Ball Express had inflicted on Wehrmacht morale and combat effectiveness. In November 1944, with railroad lines partially restored through extraordinary engineering efforts, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued as a distinct operation. But its methods, its principles, and its demonstrated effectiveness had permanently revolutionized American military logistics. The concept of continuous high-volume supply operations, accepting wasteful consumption as the cost of operational speed, became embedded in American military doctrine. Future operations in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts would reflect lessons learned from those 82 days in France. The final innovation worth noting was the extraordinary speed of the operation's dissolution once it was no longer needed. This massive operation involving 23,000 men, 6,000 vehicles, and hundreds of permanent and semi-permanent installations disappeared completely in 72 hours. Troops were reassigned to new duties, vehicles were redistributed to other units, routes were returned to French civilian control, and installations were dismantled or transferred to French authorities. Germans required months of careful planning to create operations 1/10 this size, and typically required years to properly dissolve them, carefully redistributing assets and personnel through bureaucratic processes. Americans built exactly what they needed when they needed it, used it intensively until it was no longer required, then discarded it without ceremony and built something different for the next challenge. This approach to military organization reflected American industrial culture, more than European military tradition. When German generals finally surrendered unconditionally in May 1945, many specifically cited the Red Ball Express in their interrogations as the moment they understood, continued resistance was hopeless. General Lieutenant Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most capable panzer commanders, stated during his formal interrogation, "When we finally understood your logistics capacity, when we grasped that you could supply armies faster than we could possibly destroy them, we knew the war was irrevocably lost. The Red Ball Express was a weapon against which we had no defense, no countermeasure, no response. You had weaponized your industrial capacity in ways we never anticipated." Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy and widely considered among Germany's most competent defensive commanders, was asked by American interrogators what aspect of Allied operations had surprised him most during the war. His answer was immediate and unequivocal: "Not your tanks, which we could match or sometimes exceed, not your aircraft, which we could occasionally counter. Your trucks. The Red Ball Express and similar operations showed us that you had successfully militarized your entire society's production capacity in ways we never achieved. We were fighting your factories and your industrial system, not merely your soldiers in the field. That war could not be won through battlefield excellence alone. The final compiled statistics of the Red Ball Express stand as permanent testament to American industrial warfare's effectiveness. 412,193 tons of supplies delivered to forward combat units, 122 million ton-miles of cargo transported across liberated France, 5,958 vehicles operating daily on average, with peak utilization reaching 7,000 vehicles, 23,000 total drivers employed in rotating assignments throughout the operation, 82 days of continuous operation without significant interruption, 57 million gallons of fuel consumed by the operation itself, 180,000 tires completely worn out and replaced, over 5,000 vehicles destroyed or abandoned as total losses, approximately $100 million in direct costs, 47 German divisions defeated or significantly degraded primarily through supply advantage rather than combat action. An estimated 180 days by which the war was shortened through maintained offensive momentum. These numbers tell a story that transcends pure military operations and enters the realm of civilizational competition. They represent the historical moment when warfare changed permanently and irrevocably, when industrial productive capacity became more strategically decisive than tactical battlefield brilliance, when logistics determined strategy rather than merely serving strategic objectives conceived by generals. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings that began the liberation of Western Europe, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp specifically honoring the Red Ball Express. The ceremony at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. finally provided official recognition to an operation that had been overshadowed for decades by more dramatic combat operations, but had proved equally decisive in achieving Allied victory. Elderly veterans who attended that ceremony spoke with justifiable pride about an operation that proved American industrial might and individual determination could overcome any obstacle that geography, weather, or enemy action could impose. They had driven through exhaustion that should have killed them, through mechanical failures that should have stopped them, through weather conditions that had paralyzed armies throughout history. They had been overwhelmingly black soldiers serving in a segregated, discriminatory army that denied them recognition during the war, but they had delivered victory at 35 miles per hour, proving through action what rhetoric could never convey about human capability and racial equality. The Red Ball Express proved conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, logistics is not merely support for combat operations. Logistics is the main effort, the decisive operation upon which all else depends. The operation demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that industrial democracy, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could mobilize resources on a scale and at a speed that totalitarian efficiency simply couldn't match. Despite centralized control and ruthless organization, German generals who had laughed at American logistics in August 1944, who had dismissed American supply operations as wasteful and undisciplined, who had confidently predicted American collapse based on centuries of military precedent, were silenced by 6,000 trucks delivering 12,500 tons daily across 700 miles of liberated French territory. They had assumed Americans would follow European precedent, would conserve scarce resources, would advance cautiously to maintain supply lines. Instead, Americans created a logistics tsunami that drowned German forces in Allied material abundance, that rendered German tactical skill and strategic planning increasingly irrelevant as American supplies simply overwhelmed German defenders. The operation's success came not from military genius in any traditional sense, but from distinctively American characteristics that Germans never understood and couldn't replicate. Industrial excess that treated waste as acceptable cost, mechanical aptitude widely distributed across the population rather than concentrated in specialized technicians, improvisational skill that solved problems through action rather than planning. And most importantly, the initiative of individual soldiers at junior ranks who made independent decisions that in the Wehrmacht would have required field marshal approval. In his personal memoirs published after the war, General George S. Patton, whose Third Army had been the primary beneficiary of Red Ball Express operations, wrote what stands as the ultimate tribute to these soldiers. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserve as much credit for the defeat of Nazi Germany as any combat unit that fought under my command. They drove through exhaustion that would have stopped lesser men, through mechanical failures that would have paralyzed conventional logistics, through weather that stopped our armor. Without them, the Third Army doesn't maintain its advance. Without that advance, we don't achieve the victory we did when we did. They were overwhelmingly black soldiers, serving in a segregated army, discriminated against, denied the recognition their service warranted. But they won the war as surely as any rifleman who stormed an enemy position. History must record this truth, and I am honored to state it clearly. They were superb soldiers who proved that courage and capability know no racial boundaries. That truth stands as the final and most important testament to the Red Ball Express's significance. 23,000 mostly African-American drivers operating 6,000 trucks on a purpose-built one-way highway system to victory achieved what German military science had declared flatly impossible based on centuries of experience. They supplied advancing armies faster than physics and logistics theory suggested was possible, maintained operational tempo beyond normal human endurance, and proved conclusively that in modern industrialized warfare, the side with the most trucks and the will to use them defeats the side with the best tactics and the finest generals. The German generals had laughed at American logistics in August 1944, dismissing it as wasteful, undisciplined, impossible to sustain beyond a few days or weeks. 82 days later, those same generals were surrendering to armies supplied by the Red Ball Express, finally understanding in their defeat that American trucks had proven more decisive than German tanks, that industrial abundance had overwhelmed military excellence, that logistics had become strategy itself, rather than merely supporting strategy conceived by commanders. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations on November 16, 1944, but its impact echoed through military history and continues to influence logistics planning in the 21st century. It proved irrefutably that in the industrial age and beyond, victory belongs not to the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, though those qualities remain important, but to the nation that can deliver the most supplies, the fastest, across the greatest distances, sustaining operations that less industrialized opponents simply cannot match. The German generals who laughed confidently at American logistics in August 1944 signed unconditional surrender documents in May 1945, defeated ultimately by 23,000 truck drivers who had revolutionized warfare at 35 miles per hour. Their story deserves its permanent place among the great military operations of human history, studied in detail at military academies worldwide. Not because the operation was elegant in execution, which it wasn't. Not because it was efficient by traditional measures, which it deliberately wasn't, but because despite violating nearly every principle of classical military logistics, it worked brilliantly. The Red Ball Express kept Patton's armies rolling forward, kept the Germans retreating toward their ultimate defeat, and proved forever that in modern war, the convoy of trucks often matters more than the column of tanks. The highways and roads of France still bear subtle scars from the Red Ball Express 7 decades later. Deep ruts worn by overloaded trucks have been repaved, but not entirely erased. Bridges hastily repaired by American engineers remain in service. Roadsides occasionally yield abandoned vehicle parts to farmers and construction workers. But the greatest monument to the operation isn't physical infrastructure. It's the speed of Allied victory in Western Europe, the thousands of lives saved by shortening the war, the liberation of millions achieved months earlier than would have been possible without this logistics revolution. Every day the war was shortened, saved thousands of military and civilian lives, prevented destruction of cities and infrastructure, spared populations from continued occupation and its horrors. The Red Ball Express shortened the European war by an estimated 6 months, saving perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives through its contribution to rapid victory. In the end, the German generals who laughed at American logistics learned the hardest lesson of modern industrialized warfare, a lesson that remains relevant in contemporary military planning. Military amateurs talk enthusiastically about tactics and battlefield maneuvers. Military professionals talk seriously about logistics and supply lines. But Americans talk most convincingly about trucks, about the industrial capacity to build them in unlimited numbers, about the national character to drive them beyond reasonable limits, about the organizational flexibility to deploy them wherever needed. The Red Ball Express was America making that argument very loudly indeed, making it in the roar of 6,000 engines that never stopped, carrying democracy and destruction in equal measure at 35 miles per hour down a one-way road to victory that couldn't be blocked or diverted. The last word belongs appropriately to a German officer whose name was lost to history, but whose observation was recorded by a Red Ball driver who participated in the 50th anniversary commemoration. Standing beside a road somewhere in Belgium, watching the seemingly endless convoy of American trucks roll past after his capture, this officer said in carefully accented English to his American guards, "We prepared meticulously for everything we could imagine. Your tanks, which we studied and planned to counter. Your planes, which we feared and respected. Your ships, which we knew would dominate the seas. We never prepared adequately for your trucks, for this mechanical river that never stops flowing. How do you defeat an enemy who possesses more trucks than you have soldiers, who can replace losses faster than you can inflict them, who treats the destruction of 5,000 vehicles as acceptable overhead, rather than catastrophic failure?" The answer to that German officer's rhetorical question rolled past him continuously at 5-minute intervals throughout that day and every day of the Red Ball Express's operation, driven by exhausted American soldiers who were actively rewriting the fundamental rules of warfare through sheer determination and industrial capacity. One delivery at a time, 1 ton at a time, 1 mile at a time, they were transforming logistics from a supporting function into the decisive element of modern military operations. The Red Ball Express had successfully converted supply into strategy, had elevated trucks to become the most decisive weapon of the European war, had demonstrated that modern warfare's victor would be determined not primarily on battlefields, but in factories and on highways. The German generals stopped laughing when they finally understood this fundamental truth about industrialized warfare, but by then it was far too late. Patton's tanks were already at Germany's gates, supplied by the greatest logistics operation in military history, an operation that proved American industrial democracy could defeat totalitarian efficiency through methods that appeared chaotic and wasteful, but produced results that German precision planning could never match. This is the legacy of the Red Ball Express, a legacy that extends far beyond World War II military history into broader questions about industrial capacity, racial equality, organizational philosophy, and national character. It stands as proof that in total war between industrial nations, victory ultimately belongs to the nation that can sustain its forces in the field, that can deliver supplies faster than the enemy can interdict them, that can replace losses faster than combat can inflict them. The 23,000 drivers, 75% of them African-American soldiers fighting for a country that denied them full citizenship, delivered that victory at 35 miles per hour on French highways in the autumn of 1944. They deserve to be remembered not as a footnote to more dramatic combat operations, but as the decisive force that made those combat operations possible, that kept Allied armies advancing when German calculations insisted they must halt, that proved logistics could become the war-winning strategy itself. Their trucks carried more than ammunition and rations and fuel. They carried the proof that American industrial might, guided by American determination and flexibility, could overcome any obstacle that Nazi Germany's vaunted military machine could place in its path. That is the true story of the Red Ball Express, a story of victory achieved not through battlefield heroics alone, but through the unglamorous, exhausting, absolutely critical work of keeping armies supplied and mobile. It is a story that every student of military history, every logistics professional, every person interested in how nations actually win wars rather than merely fight them, should know and remember and study. Because in the end, wars are won not by the army with the best soldiers or the finest generals, though those matter, but by the nation that can keep its soldiers equipped, fed, fueled, and fighting longer than the enemy can sustain resistance. The Red Ball Express proved that truth beyond any possible doubt, and that lesson remains as valid today as it was in 1944, when American trucks conquered Nazi Germany one delivery at a time.